Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some Italian Renaissance recommendations. I don't want to just call this Renaissance recommendations in general because there was a lot going on in the North in terms of the Northern Renaissance, and the majority of what I have to talk about is almost exclusively about the Italian Renaissance, and Italy is essentially where the Renaissance started. So today, this is all about nonfiction. I have several recommendations lists in terms of the Renaissance on my channel. In fact, I have a playlist. So I'll link to that down below because I have some Medici recommendations, Borgia recommendations, and things like that. This is going to be about more general nonfiction that is looking at the time period more broadly. So I wanted to separate this into sections, but it seems like I just have recommendations that are all over the place. So let's go on and get into them. The first book that I want to recommend is the one that I think is probably going to be of most value to you, and that is Renaissance People, Lives That Shaped the Modern Age. This is a series of mini biographies of people who were important throughout the entire Renaissance period, not just in the Italian Renaissance, but also covering the Northern Renaissance and covering essentially from the very, very beginning of the Renaissance around 1400 up to the end in the 1600s. And so this covers a really broad time span, but it also covers a wide variety of individuals. To me, this is the best recommendation, and it's also going to be the one that I think you would come back to the most, because to me, this introduced me to a lot of people that I knew absolutely nothing about. I think this is really great because you can read about different individuals and you can decide from what you've read about them whether they are someone that you're really interested in learning more about, and then that would be the time to pursue a more lengthy biography of them. This is a book that I have returned to time and time again. It's really one of the most valuable books that I have in terms of reference shelves, I think, because I just keep coming back to this. And I often will mark people that I'm interested in currently. Some of these people really don't have much written about them, especially in the modern day. And so sometimes the mini biography that you get in this book is essentially all you're going to be able to find in terms of modern scholarship. And I think that's a real shame. But I think it also just shows how brilliant this book is, because it really has captured a wide variety of people who were just imperative to the Renaissance in general. I picked this up when I was in Rome in 2019, I believe, and I remember exactly where I was because it was a really great bookstore in Trastevere. It was a fantastic bookstore that had a lot of great nonfiction about the Renaissance, but this one really caught my eye, and the bookseller told me just how valuable it would be to have on hand, especially if you're someone who's really interested in the Renaissance. I think this offers a lot of new perspectives, and it offers you a lot of new names, even if you feel like you're very well read, specifically in terms of the Italian Renaissance. The next book that I want to recommend is a little bit controversial. I didn't realize that this book was as widely hated as it is, but this is The Ugly Renaissance by Alexander Lee. This is also a book that I picked up in 2019 when I was visiting Italy, but I think I got this in Milan at another absolutely fantastic bookstore. This purports to be about sex, disease, and excess in the age of beauty. And so it really kind of sets itself up to be about gross things. It really wants to explore kind of the darker side of the Renaissance, when from the outside looking in, we really think of it as a time of light and a time of absolute beauty. And of course, I think most of us know that's not really what the time period was all about. So you go into this, I think, with the perspective that it's going to get really ugly, as the title implies. But to me, it never really goes there in the way that you would expect. I think this is very mild in terms of how ugly it actually gets. But recently, I was looking at my Goodreads for a couple of videos that I've done on my channel, looking at the worst books that I have ever read and the best books that I have ever read, kind of by general average rating there on Goodreads. This was in the top 20 for the worst books that I have ever read. This was incredibly lowly rated, especially for nonfiction. I feel like people tend to rate nonfiction higher. So this one, just take it with a grain of salt. I read this a few years ago and I really enjoyed it. I also felt like it really offered something new. I really liked the structure of this book because it separated it into kind of three levels of society that you could be at: the patron, the artist, and then I believe kind of the commoner, which was really interesting because I think when we think of the Italian Renaissance specifically, we are often thinking of artists. And so this book has an entire section that is dedicated to them. But what parsing the book out into those sections means is that you're not getting a complete story. You're kind of hopping around in terms of timeline. And so I do think that can make this one a little bit hard to read. So maybe this shouldn't be your introductory modern nonfiction to the Renaissance, but I really enjoyed it. I think there was a lot of value in it. Is it as ugly as the title implies? Probably not, but I do think there was a lot of really interesting information here. Perhaps this is one that I should reread, but I did really enjoy it at the time, and it's one that I've thought on very frequently. I rated it 4 stars, so I really enjoyed it, but definitely maybe look at some other reviews for this one because I might be the odd man out. Before I get into some more specific recommendations, I did want to talk about a book that I think is kind of a giant in terms of Renaissance scholarship. This is an older work. I was just going to say classic nonfiction about the Italian Renaissance and kind of primary sources from the Italian Renaissance for a separate video, but this is also an older book. It was written in the 70s. It was extremely instrumental in scholarship of the 70s in terms of the Italian Renaissance, but I personally think it is still incredibly valuable to read today. I think it is really, really one of the best books we have on the Italian Renaissance. And that is Painting an Experience in 15th Century Italy. This is a cover that may come as no surprise to some of y'all. I feel like it's a very famous cover, and even if you haven't read it, I think you're very familiar with what this work is because it's really just a giant in terms of Italian Renaissance scholarship. You may be saying, Jenny, I'm not really interested in painting. I'm not really interested in the technicalities of that because I'm not an artist. I'm not an artist either, but I do really think the technicalities of painting are incredibly fascinating, specifically for this time period. But what this book does is it doesn't just analyze kind of the process of painting and what was really so revolutionary about what was going on in 15th century Italy in terms of innovations in painting. It does look at that, and it does it in a very interesting way, but this book also really looks at art as a commodity and painting as a business. So I think that is also one of the more fascinating aspects of the Italian Renaissance is the relationship between patron and artists kind of being hired out. A lot of this is not just because, hey, we are divinely inspired and we really want to paint some absolutely gorgeous fresco on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel of God creating Adam. We're being paid to do this. And so what the patron wants is very much instrumental to how the piece turns out. That means there is a political bent to a lot of art pieces from the Italian Renaissance. It also means that in many ways there is a religious aspect because sometimes it's churches paying to be painted. It is a very, very fascinating look into the world of painting in the Renaissance, specifically painting as a business. And I think this is still incredibly valuable, especially because it is a book, though it was written 50 years ago, it is a book that has gone through several revisions, and so you can get a more updated version of the text. And I do think it's really, really valuable. It's also very short. It won't take you that long to read, but this has been consistently used as a textbook in Renaissance courses at university level for a very long time. So make of that what you will. In places, I do think this can be fairly dense, and I think this might be one for someone who's just really obsessed with the Renaissance and who really wants to know more in detail about patron-clientship a little bit more. I really love this because I'm not only fascinated by kind of the political, social aspect of painting like that, painting as a business, but I also am really fascinated by the innovations that were going on, and that's also discussed at length in this book. So I just really think this is a great one, and I do highly recommend it. Let's just call this next section Florence, because I think when we think of the Italian Renaissance, Florence is what automatically comes to mind, as it should. There have been a lot of great books written about Florence's impact on the Italian Renaissance and just in general on art during this period, but I do have a few favorites. And so one of these is also an older book that has also been consistently used as a textbook. Just go with me here. But this is Renaissance Florence by Jean Brucker. This is still just an incredible book to have on hand. I think this is a really great one to have for reference. This is really analyzing Florence from around the 1380s to around the 1450s, so kind of that early Renaissance period when a lot of innovations are being made. This is also not just focused on art, it's focused on the history of Florence during this period as kind of a city-state. Would I call this light reading? Probably not. This is a book that I have always dipped in and out of for research. This is a book that I have consistently dipped in and out of for research purposes because the early Renaissance is one of my favorite time periods of the Renaissance, and in fact might actually be my favorite period of the Renaissance. I like it a little bit more than the High Renaissance. And believe it or not, it's actually very rare for a book to focus on that time period at all. So I think this one is really valuable. But again, this has always been used as a textbook. That's why I have this. This was my textbook, you can see. So I think that might make this a little bit more dense reading. It's probably not one just to sit and read. It's probably not light reading, like I said, but I do think it's really, really enjoyable. And you can see how I've marked it up. I think this is really valuable in terms of research, but I also do think it's just really valuable in terms of scholarship. I do think it's readable for something to have been used as a textbook. I really do think this is very readable on a prose level, and I think you can learn a lot from it. So if you're specifically interested in Florence, I really do think this is one of the best books out there. Also, in terms of just Florentine history, one of my favorite moments in the Italian Renaissance is when Savonarola is in power in Florence. And so I do want to recommend Paul Strathern's book on Savonarola. That's just called Death in Florence, and it's specifically about Savonarola, the Medicis, and Florence in that late 1400s period, specifically in the 1490s when the Medici are expelled from the city. The Medici, if you don't know, were the ruling family in Florence, and Savonarola was a churchman who rose very, very high in the late 1400s, and he really did not like them. He really preached asceticism. He really did not like at all the vibe of the Renaissance. Having all of these rich pieces in your house, valuing art, he was totally, totally against that, and he was an incredibly persuasive speaker. And so eventually, his power over Florence led to something called the Bonfire of the Vanities, where basically everyone would bring out all their most valuable possessions, including their art pieces, and they would toss it on a fire in the center of the city. Botticelli most famously burned some of his own art pieces in the Bonfire of the Vanities. So Savonarola was a really good speaker. This is an interesting nonfiction. It's one of the few nonfictions that I've seen look at Savonarola in a way that I would say is maybe more nuanced. He is typically just viewed in general as a religious zealot who didn't like the progress of society. And so in many ways in the modern day, he's always talked about in a very disparaging way because he led to the loss of one of Raphael's paintings, for example. He's just looked at as someone who wasn't with it. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that people view him as extremely religious, as a zealot. I think he's fascinating, 100% I think he's fascinating, and I think it's because I know that if I was there, I would have been listening to him, and I would have said, yeah, take all this stuff. I just know that I would have fallen prey to him. But this is a really interesting nonfiction because it pairs him with the Medici. Savonarola can also very interestingly be paired with the Borgia family, so if you're interested in the Borgias, I think he's someone to read about. Paul Strathern also has a book just entirely about the Medici family. And if you have read that, then there's no need to read Death in Florence. And if you have read Death in Florence, there might be a little bit more you could get out of that Medici book, but I still think they're covering a lot of the same ground, really the most interesting years of the Medici family in Florence. I have a pretty massive problem with his straightforward Medici biography because I really did not like the tone that it took in terms of religious conversations or conversations about the Renaissance artists being members of the LGBTQ+ community. It's wrong to say, in my opinion, that you could say any of the artists' sexuality with any kind of certainty because you absolutely could not. But I think many of us would say that a lot of the Renaissance artists fell somewhere on the LGBTQ+ spectrum, and I found Paul Strathern's attitude towards that very disparaging. I also found his attitude toward religion incredibly disparaging in that Medici book, and I was left wondering why, if you had a problem with either one of those things, why on earth you were writing about the Medici family in particular, but in general, why Renaissance Italy would have been a point of attraction for you at all. Because I think if you have an issue with those things, then really, I don't know why this is a point of research for you. So I really hesitate to recommend that because I had a lot of problems with his own personal opinions about the artists in general, but also in terms of some of his opinions about the Medici family. I think Death in Florence is a stronger book. If you're more interested in the Medici though, he does have a great Medici book, but so does Christopher Hibbert. I have a video all about the Medici family and some recommendations that I have for them, so I'll try to remember to link that down below, but I talked about those two books there more at length. I may also have mentioned this next book in that Medici video, but I still think it's a great one, so I want to recommend it. It is April Blood. This is a nonfiction that is all about a singular event in the Italian Renaissance that involves the Medici family and the Pazzi family, and that is the Pazzi conspiracy. Now, I also have an entire video about the Pazzi conspiracy, but what happened here is that the Pazzi family, a rival banking family in Florence, the Medici were really big in the banking world. That's how they made their fortune. The Pazzis have basically had enough. They really do think the Medici have too much power, and so they plot to kill Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and his brother Giuliano at Mass in the Florence Duomo one Sunday. And this is successful in some ways because they do kill Giuliano, but they don't manage to kill Lorenzo. And what happens afterward is Lorenzo de' Medici's massive revenge campaign on the Pazzi family. And so this book is looking at that event in an immense amount of detail. It's talking a lot about Lorenzo de' Medici. This is one of the better books on Lorenzo de' Medici that I have read. I know he has a couple of biographies out there, but I haven't been a massive fan of any of them. I really like this book because I like its portrayal of him. But the scheme the Pazzi family came up with is so crazy to read about. I mean, truly, it is jaw-dropping to read about, in my opinion. So this one is a fun ride. I think it's a really approachable nonfiction. I think it is also just a very interesting period in time. I think you can learn a lot through this event about Florence at the time, but also about the hold that the Medici family had on Florence and how powerful they were. So I think this is a really valuable book for that, and I think it really offers a window into the late 1400s in particular. It's really fascinating. This is one of my favorite nonfictions I have ever read on the Renaissance. Let's take a moment and talk about the artists. There is a really big biography out there of one of the most famous Renaissance artists, and I don't think that we could make this video without talking about it. That is Walter Isaacson's biography of Leonardo da Vinci. This is a banger. This is everything that you have ever heard that it was. It is truly fantastic scholarship. It is immensely readable. It's genuinely fascinating. My only caveat with this, the only reason I would hesitate to recommend it, is that Leonardo da Vinci was a genius. I think we all know this, but he was more specifically kind of an architectural, scientific genius. And so a lot of this book is spent on his calculations, his journals, how he would map things out. He was very scientific minded. And I'll be straight up with y'all, I'm not. So a lot of this book did feel like it went over my head. But Da Vinci is also not my favorite of the Renaissance artists, but this really left me with a lot of respect for him. I think this is a really great window into his life. I know for a lot of people, Da Vinci holds just a massive amount of fascination, and this book really does clue you in to who he was on a level. I learned a lot from this. I learned to respect Leonardo da Vinci from this, but Leonardo da Vinci is just such an interesting person because he didn't often finish a lot. He would get started on things, and then he would become more interested in something else. And so he very rarely finished projects, which I do think is probably the mark of a genius, that your mind is moving a little bit too fast for your hands. This is probably the most famous book on my list. It's an awards darling, and I really do see why. I think this is incredible nonfiction. And if you have ever wanted to know anything about Leonardo da Vinci, I think it's a great book to start with. I really don't think he throws you in at the deep end at all. I also think it could be a great place to start just in terms of the Renaissance artists, because he explains quite a bit of Leonardo da Vinci's art process, which I think will help you if you want to read more about other artists. I also want to recommend Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling by Ross King. Ross King is a giant in terms of art history and just in terms of Italian Renaissance history. But his most famous book, I think, is Brunelleschi's Dome. That is one that I haven't gotten around to because, once again, I'm not very architectural, scientific minded. And I think that book would stray there in a way that probably wouldn't be that fun for me. But Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling is, of course, about the creation of the Sistine Chapel. It is very much about who Michelangelo is as a person, who Pope Julius II is as a person, and kind of their relationship to each other. Michelangelo very famously did not want to work on the Sistine Chapel. He did not view himself as a painter at all. He viewed himself as a sculptor. Isn't that crazy? Imagine the person who painted the Sistine Chapel saying, I'm not that good at this. Michelangelo was just a really interesting person. He is my favorite, probably, of the Ninja Turtle artists. And I think he is one of my favorite Renaissance artists. He's just incredible. The Sistine Chapel is the more interesting of his art pieces to read a book about because there was a lot that went into it. It was really, really involved. And he warred against it for a long time. Even when he was working on the project, he didn't really want to do it. And so this book also delves into the rivalry that he developed with Raphael. Raphael was working on the Raphael rooms in the Vatican at the same time that Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo did not want Raphael to see what he was doing. It's really funny. I think most people would say David is his masterpiece. I agree with that totally. I think his sculptures are his masterpieces, but this is the one that I think you would want an entire book about because it is genuinely fascinating, especially from his perspective to say that he didn't really want to do it and also that he didn't think he was a masterclass painter. So there are a lot of things that he goes through to be able to do this and to perform this work at the level that he was at. It is genuinely jaw-dropping to me. This is a fantastic read. I can only imagine that Brunelleschi's Dome is a similarly fascinating read, so I do need to get around to that one, but I really enjoyed this and I highly recommend it. If you were interested in the Renaissance artists, I think this is a really great one. In terms of science, because that's also ongoing during the Italian Renaissance, of course, we're also going through developments in science, and the Leonardo da Vinci biography will hint at that. But we also have a book that I was assigned to read. I took many a course on the Italian Renaissance in university, but one book we were assigned was Galileo's Daughter. This is about Galileo, but it's also about his daughter, who is a really interesting figure in her own right, and their relationship to each other was very fraught and very interesting. This is another nonfiction that I think has gotten fairly low ratings across Goodreads, but I don't think it's that popular. I wanted to recommend it because I do think it's one of the few that I have read that really analyzed religion, science, and art all side by side. Of course, Galileo's story in particular is a story of science versus religion, which of course is not what it should be. It should be religion and science, which is how Galileo views it. He doesn't think he's doing anything wrong with the telescope and with observing the fact that the Earth moves around the sun. He doesn't see anything blasphemous about that. So this is a really interesting book if you're interested in that kind of broader conversation that was ongoing throughout the Italian Renaissance about scientific development versus religious development. I think this kind of hints at things that come later on, especially in the Northern Renaissance in terms of the Reformation. But his relationship with his daughter is really, really interesting, and it's not great. It's just really not great. So I can understand why this is a book that probably won't hit for everyone, why it's a book that a lot of people rated lowly. I definitely can see why, and it's certainly been many, many years since I read this, so maybe take this recommendation also with a grain of salt. But I personally got a lot out of it. Last but not least, let's talk about, I think, one of the other big names in terms of the Italian Renaissance, and that would be the Borgias. Now, I have a video that is all about historical fiction that talks about the Borgias because that's one of my sweet spots. I love to read historical fiction about them, and I think historical fiction is far more interesting than any nonfiction on them. A lot of the most interesting things about the Borgias happen to be the rumors about them, in my opinion. The best nonfiction on the Borgias you will find is the one by G.J. Miller. Now, G.J. Miller also has a book on the Tudors that I don't recommend and that I really did not like. But for some reason, I really liked this book on the Borgias. I think this gives the appropriate amount of attention to each individual member of the family. The Borgias are a really large family, but they have three big names. We have Daddy, Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. We have son, Cesare. And we have daughter Lucrezia. Now, there are also other children who were interesting in their own right, but those are the three big names. And I think all three of them get their due in this book. They get a lot of attention. I think Alexander VI is really fascinating, the Pope. And a lot of people, when they go to the Vatican, they take like the fast tour. They want to see the Raphael rooms. They want to see the Sistine Chapel. And that's kind of it. Don't do it. You should take the option where you kind of get to look around by yourself, because near the Raphael rooms are the Borgia rooms, which are the rooms that Alexander VI had put in for his family. And their emblem is everywhere. It's incredible. You can see furniture that they sat on, and they're some of the prettiest rooms in the Vatican. I said what I said. They are, in fact, some of the prettiest rooms in the Vatican. The Borgias are a source of endless fascination for me, and so I really think this is a great biography of them. There are individual biographies out there of Lucrezia specifically, but also of Rodrigo or Alexander VI, and Cesare. I have never read a biography of Cesare that I thought was satisfactory, but I have read a couple of good ones about Lucrezia. I think she is now the most famous member of the family, and she is the member of the family that I think garners the most sympathy in the modern day. So she's been the one who's gotten the most scholarship in the modern day. But this is a great entry book into the family itself. If you know nothing about the Borgias, boy, you're in for a good time. This video went a little bit longer than what I expected, but I hope that you got some good recommendations out of this. Maybe I will do a video on classics of the Italian Renaissance, because I also think that would be valuable. But I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, if you have any recommendations for the Italian Renaissance. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.